Hello class, I'm Michael Moulton, and tonight I will be demonstrating how to disassemble a 6-hour 5.16 rifle. 5.56 rounds are used for this rifle. But before I get started, I'd like to say that it's always important that when weapons are not being operational or being used, always store them in a proper storage case or weapons box with a lock preferably to make sure they are stored out of reach of children. Weapons can be very dangerous. And with that being said, always treat every weapon as if it's loaded. That is very important. You never want to point or aim a weapon in the direction unless you are using it. For my purposes, we will use it in combat or to provide self-defense. Use that only as a last resort. Never point weapons unless you're planning on using them. And as I get started here, what I'm going to do is go through a little bit. This is going to be basic disassembling. Alright, so as I said before, here's the rifle. What you want to do before you do anything with the rifle, always inspect. First, make sure it's on safe. And there's a selector switch, which you can see here. It's on safe. And so you always want to make sure it's safe. Next step is you always want to aim it in a safe direction, and you want to pull back the charging handle. Then you want to observe the chamber inside here to make sure there's no rounds. Now, I'm not going to click it. I know it's not loaded or anything because it's been stored. But to get to the next point is we have what we call pivot pins that keeps what you call the upper receiver and the lower receiver. That keeps it together. So what we are going to do here, there are two pins here. The rear, and sometimes this can be a little bit of pain. So I've brought a pin here. You want to lightly tap if possible. And you have one out here on the side. And then there's a second. It's very important that when you're disassembling a weapon, always have a place to store it. Preferably, like I use, is a table to make sure, because there are very small parts that comes with this. So now I have the lower receiver. And with the lower receiver, you'll notice that all you have is a stop. The butt stop and the lower receiver with the grip. Next, you want to remove the buffer and the buffer springs, which is here. This is what helps tap the firing pin forward when it is being fired. I retract. Let me go back and state that this is actually used for buffer. It's a buffer spring. It helps to control the recoil. When you have weak buffer springs, you'll notice that if you're shooting a weapon and you place it in the pocket of your shoulder, it controls the amount of kick. So this is what the buffer is used for. So to be safe, you always want to at least put some pressure down on the buffer because it is spring, and if you're not safe with it, it will fire, it will pop. And there's a little catch pin that holds this in place. Notice as I take this apart, it is coming out. And here we go. It's a two-part system. You have the spring itself, and then you have the buffer. Of course, I probably should have used gloves because this is still pretty oil. Storing weapons, I always want to make sure they're oil. So this one is on pretty good, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Next, you have what you call the bolt carrier. So the bolt carrier is slid out easily by grabbing the charging handle. And now you have what you call, and you remove the charging handle. Next, you have what you call the bolt assembly. Now notice here, there's a very small pin here, retainer pin. That's why it's always very important to hold it, to keep this on a surface where you can see, because this pin can easily get lost. So you want to remove the retainer pin. Boom. Next, you tap down and you have what your firing pin. Always inspect the firing pin to make sure it is not bent or burnt out at the end. They can all be replaced. Parts are replaceable. Next, remain the bolt holder or the firing pin holder, and you want to lay that out of the way. Next, we have the firing ring and the firing assembly. Here, always inspect the firing rings and make sure they're not bent or grooves are good, and keep it clean. Okay, and then of course you have the bolt itself. So that's as far as I'm going to break this down tonight. Very important. Like I said before, always make sure it's safety. All right, we're going to start by putting this back together, sliding in the bolt for the firing. Always want to make sure it's open face, so when you put the pin back in, the holding pin, sometimes you may have to turn opposite direction, and you drop it back in. Make sure it's turned back. Next, you're going to get the firing pin. It's always better to hold it, because put your hands around the holes to drop the firing pin so it can slide back in easily. Alright, and then you want the retainer pin to slide back into hold the firing pin together. And you want to snap it out, make sure it's out, like so. Take the upper receiver, turn it upside down, replace the charging handle. While the charging handle sits, you take the bolt carrier, slide it back in, lock it into place. You want to take the lower receiver and replace the buffer spring. Like so, controlling, make sure it locks back in place, controlling. Then you will put it back. The upper receiver and the lower receiver will then be attached. And then the starting where we have the pivot pins, the front pins you want to push back in place. It's a little bit here, it's a little bit challenging sometimes, so you have to make sure it's properly aligned. Here, make sure that they are secured back in. And then you want to make sure that the dust cover is closed. The dust covers are going to keep the dust and everything out. So therefore, when it's firing and you're operating, it doesn't feed in. Now the dust cover will pop open, but it is to protect it while it is being stored or laying in a place that collects a lot of dust, because it could disrupt firing. Okay, and remember, always place it back on safe. Make sure it is on safe. And then what you want to do at the end is make sure you store it back in its proper carrying case. I have a rifle carrying case, so I utilize that. So hopefully you got a little bit out of this, demonstrating on how to disassemble. I wish I had a little bit more time to kind of go through actual doing a functions check, because that is very important. If you don't do a function check on a weapon, you cannot tell whether or not it will be able to properly fire. But until next time, class, hope you enjoyed. Thank you.